In the winter of 1946, a man stood on a gallows in Budapest, not trembling, not begging, but smiling. He believed, even in that final moment, that history would vindicate him. It didn't. What happened next was so brutal, so deliberately humiliating, that the Hungarian government kept parts of it classified for decades. And today, you're going to see exactly why. His name was Ferenc Szalasi, and if you've never heard that name before, that's not an accident. Most history books give him a footnote, a sentence, maybe a paragraph, but this man, this one man, transformed a nation into a slaughterhouse in less than a year. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a military genius. He wasn't even particularly intelligent by the accounts of people who met him. He was a true believer, and that made him far more dangerous than any soldier with a gun. Because soldiers follow orders. True believers create them. Szalasi didn't just collaborate with the Nazis. He out-brutalized them in his own backyard. In the final months of World War II, when even the SS was beginning to calculate its own survival, Szalasi's Arrow Cross militia was still dragging Jewish men, women, and children to the banks of the Danube and shooting them into the frozen river. Thousands of shoes still line that riverbank today. Every single pair belonged to someone who was told to remove them before they were murdered, because shoes were considered too valuable to waste. Let that image stay with you for a moment, because that is who we are talking about. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists to make sure stories like this are never forgotten. We don't glorify, we document. Hit subscribe if that matters to you. And stay with me, because what comes next is darker than most people know. Ferenc Szálasi was born in 1897 in Kassa, a city that today belongs to Slovakia, but was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was a soldier's son, disciplined, rigid, obsessed with order in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. And after World War I, when Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory under the Treaty of Trianon, that chaos became his fuel. Imagine waking up one morning and being told that the country you were born in no longer exists in the shape you knew. That's what Trianon felt like to millions of Hungarians. Szálasi felt it personally. He turned that grief into ideology, a twisted, mystical brand of fascism he called Hungarism. Part nationalism, part racial theory, part something that even the Nazis found strange. Heinrich Himmler reportedly described Szálasi as a confused fanatic. And when Himmler calls you confused, you need to stop and think about that. But Hitler needed Hungary, and Hungary, under Szálasi, needed Hitler. So in October 1944, with Soviet forces closing in, and the Hungarian regent Miklós Horthy attempting to negotiate a secret armistice with the Allies, the Nazis did something extraordinary. They handed an entire country to a man, most of their own leadership considered unstable. Szálasi was brought to power in a coup, backed by German tanks. He was in office for less than 6 months. In that time, he turned Budapest into hell. The moment Szálasi took power, Budapest stopped being a city. It became a hunting ground. Within hours of the coup, Arrow Cross militiamen were already on the streets. Young men, some barely teenagers, wearing green shirts and red armbands, carrying rifles they barely knew how to hold. But they knew exactly what they had been told to do. Hunt. The Jews of Budapest had survived this long through a combination of luck, resistance, and the protective papers issued by diplomats like Raoul Wallenberg. Some were hidden, some were protected, some had dared to believe the worst was behind them. Szálasi ended that hope in a single afternoon. He immediately suspended all protective documents, every safe house, every diplomatic letter, every carefully negotiated arrangement that had kept tens of thousands of people alive. Gone with one signature. And that's the part that should make your blood run cold, because it wasn't chaos. It wasn't soldiers losing control in the heat of battle. It was policy, organized, deliberate, signed on official government paper. What followed over the next several weeks became known as one of the most concentrated atrocities of the entire Holocaust. Arrow Cross units began rounding up Jewish men, women, elderly, and children, dragging them from their homes, from the ghetto, from wherever they could be found. They were marched to the banks of the Danube River. There, they were ordered to remove their shoes. Then they were tied together in groups of 3 using wire, not rope, and the person in the middle was shot. When that person fell into the freezing river, the weight pulled the other 2 in with them. 1 bullet, 3 deaths. This wasn't warfare. This was engineering. Szalasi's men killed thousands this way, sometimes through the night, working by torchlight on the frozen riverbank while the city slept just meters away. Some Budapest residents heard the shots. Most chose not to ask questions. And Szalasi, he was in his office writing speeches about Hungarian national destiny. Here is the detail that historians find most disturbing about Ferenc Szálasi. He genuinely believed he was a good man, not in the way that war criminals sometimes claim innocence to save their lives, but genuinely, in his soul, with complete sincerity. He kept a detailed personal diary throughout his entire leadership, and in that diary, there is almost no mention of the massacres. Instead, there are long philosophical passages about Hungarian spiritual destiny, about racial purity as a form of love for his people, about God. He prayed daily. He considered himself deeply religious. This is what ideological possession looks like at its most terrifying. A man who has convinced himself so completely that his hatred is actually compassion, that no amount of bodies in the Danube can interrupt his sense of personal virtue. He wasn't a monster who knew he was a monster. He was a monster who thought he was a saint. And that distinction matters, because it's far more common in history than we like to admit. By February 1945, Soviet forces had fully encircled Budapest. The city was in ruins. Hundreds of thousands were dead. The Arrow Cross militias were dissolving, men quietly dropping their armbands and disappearing into the civilian population. Szálasi did not stay to face the consequences. He fled west toward Germany, carrying with him crates of Hungarian national treasures, gold, artwork, state documents that he insisted belonged to the future Hungarian empire he still believed he would one day lead. Even as everything burned behind him, he was planning his comeback. He was captured by American forces in Bavaria in May 1945. When they told him the war was over, that Germany had surrendered, he reportedly asked them to confirm the news twice. He simply could not process it, because in his mind, the cause was eternal. The cause didn't lose. The cause couldn't lose. It just needed more time. He was extradited back to Hungary, back to the country he had drowned in blood to face trial. And the trial itself was something history rarely discusses in detail. Budapest, November 1945. The city was still in ruins. Buildings stood with their walls blown open like broken teeth. The Danube still carried the memory of what had been done on its banks less than a year before. And in a cold, stripped-down courtroom, Ferenc Szálasi sat facing his judges. He was not broken. He was not ashamed. He walked in straight-backed, composed, dressed neatly, as if he had arrived for a government meeting rather than a war crimes tribunal. And then he opened his mouth. What came out stunned everyone in the room. He didn't deny the massacres. He didn't claim ignorance. He didn't beg. Instead, he defended everything. Every deportation, every execution, every body pulled from the Danube. He presented it all as necessary, justified, morally correct. He spoke about Hungarism as though it were still a living political movement, as though Soviet tanks weren't literally parked outside the building. The judges stared at him. The prosecutors stared at him. Even the guards, men who had seen the full documentation of what his regime had done, looked at each other in quiet disbelief. This man was not performing confidence. He had it. Genuine, unshakable, terrifying confidence. Right up until the moment the judge read the verdict. Death, March 12, 1946. The morning of the execution, Szálasi was given last rites by a Catholic priest, a request he made sincerely, still believing God was on his side. He ate breakfast. He wrote a final note, not an apology, not a farewell to loved ones, but a political statement, a declaration that Hungarism would rise again, that history would remember him correctly. He folded it neatly, handed it to a guard. The guard put it in a file that wouldn't be opened for decades. When they came to take him, he walked. No struggling, no crying, no last-minute collapse into the kind of naked human terror that most of us would feel in that moment. He walked to the gallows the way a man walks to a podium, like he was about to give a speech. What happened next is documented. It is on record. And in the footage that exists, which is exactly why this video carries its warning, it is deeply, uncomfortably real. 3 men were executed that day. Szálasi, his former Prime Minister during Stage, and László Bardasi, another collaborator premier. The gallows were set up in the prison courtyard. It was cold, gray, the kind of morning that feels like the world itself is holding its breath. When the noose was placed around Szálasi's neck, witnesses reported that he looked straight ahead. Not at the crowd, not at the sky, not searching for something to hold on to. Just forward, as if he was staring at a future only he could see. The trapdoor opened, and Ferenc Szálasi, the man who had ordered thousands of people tied together with wire and shot into a frozen river, was gone. It took longer than it should have. That detail is in the official records too. His body was buried in an unmarked location. The Hungarian government wanted no grave, no marker, no place that could ever become a site of pilgrimage for the ideology he had served. For decades it worked. But ideology doesn't need a grave. It needs believers. And in the years that followed, quietly, in certain corners of Hungarian politics, Szálasi's name never fully disappeared. There are people today who consider him a patriot. That is not ancient history. That is a conversation happening right now. Here is what I want you to take from this video. Ferenc Szálasi was not a supernatural evil. He was not born different from you or me. He was a man who chose an ideology over his own humanity, and then spent the rest of his life convincing himself that the choice had been righteous. The shoes on the Danube riverbank are still there. Not the original shoes, those rotted long ago, but iron sculptures, cast in the exact shapes of the shoes people removed before they were murdered. Men's shoes, women's shoes, children's shoes. Small ones. If you ever stand in front of those sculptures, and I hope one day you do, you will feel something that no documentary, no script, no YouTube video can fully give you. You will feel the weight of what happens when ordinary people stop asking questions, when they hear the shots at night and choose not to ask. That weight belongs to all of us, because remembering is not passive. Remembering is a choice, and you just made it. If this video gave you something, a fact, a feeling, a reason to think differently, share it with one person. Not for the algorithm, for the shoes. Subscribe if you want more history told this way, honest, deep, and human. I'll see you in the next one.